The blast was Finn's. He knew at the moment the second shockwave came. Wrong direction, wrong delay. The first one had been his, a controlled detonation on the north-facing chute, above Gallatin Canyon Road. Textbook execution. Exactly what Montana paid him to do at 5:47 in the morning when nobody sane was awake. But the second one, deeper, lower, from somewhere down in the canyon itself, that one had nothing to do with him. He pulled the radio off his chest harness before the echo finished rolling through the mountains. Dispatch, this is Callahan, Avalanche Control Unit 4. I need someone to tell me what just happened at the Gallatin Canyon rail crossing. Over. 3 seconds of static. Then, Finn, we're getting reports of a derailment. Empire Builder, westbound. 3 cars off the track near mile marker 31. We have no visual. Canyon Road is already drifting shut. He turned and looked down the mountain. The sky had gone the color of old nickels 2 hours ago, the kind of sky that didn't negotiate. He'd been watching it all morning the way you watch something you don't trust. Now the first serious snow was coming sideways off the bridgers, and the canyon below him was disappearing into white. How many passengers? He asked the unknown. Train manifest says 147. 147 people. 3 cars off the track. Canyon walls on both sides, a river on one, and every access road either already closed or closing. He started moving. Emre Demir had been awake since 3 a.m. This was not unusual. He kept a cot in the back room of the Gallatin Valley Wilderness Medical Clinic, specifically because November in Montana had a way of making his phone ring at hours. That didn't exist in polite society. Tonight it had been a snowmobiler with a dislocated shoulder, easy work. In and out in 40 minutes. Then he tried to sleep and his brain had other plans. He was on his second cup of coffee when the call came in. Dr. Demir. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Harlan Cole, which meant this wasn't a sprained ankle. We have a situation in the canyon. Train derailment, Gallatin Narrows. I need your team staged and ready to go in 10 minutes. Road conditions? Bad and getting worse. We're looking at canyon access from the north end only, and we've got maybe a 2-hour window before that closes too. Who do I coordinate with on scene? A pause. We're putting you through to our avalanche control tech. He's already up there. Knows that terrain better than anyone alive. His name's Callahan. Emre was already pulling on his jacket. Patch him through. The voice that came through Finn's radio was calm in a way that took a specific kind of training. To achieve, Callahan, this is Dr. Demir, Gallatin Wilderness Medical. I'm coming in from the north access point with a 4-person trauma team. I need you to walk me through the safe corridor. Finn was already traversing the ridgeline. Calculating. How far out are you? 20 minutes from the north gate. Maybe less, okay? He stopped, looked at the slope below him, the angles. The wind loading on the east-facing rolls. The new fracture line he'd been watching develop for 3 days. Dr. Demir, do you have any experience with avalanche terrain? I've done 7 backcountry extractions in the last 2 years. I know what a crown fracture looks like. Good. Then I need you to listen to everything I say and not argue with me. A beat. Then, understood. That was when Finn realized this was going to be different from most coordination calls he ran. Most people argued. Most people thought their urgency outweighed his expertise. This man had said understood like he meant it. And Finn felt something he didn't have a name for settle into his chest, something that felt, strangely, like relief. Here's what I'm looking at, Finn said. You have 3 viable corridors into the canyon from the north. West route is out. I was watching that slope load for 2 days, and it went this morning. Natural release. The road underneath is buried under for meters. East route goes down to the river, but you'll be crossing 3 blind convex rolls. And with this wind, I won't guarantee anything past the second one. And the third? Center chute. It's where I run my control work. I know every pressure point on it. I can talk you through every step. Then that's the one we take. No hesitation. Talk me through it for the next 18 minutes. Finn stood at the ridge and guided a man he'd never seen through the most dangerous piece of terrain. In Gallatin County, he told Emre where to angle his team's snowshoes. He told him which rock formation marked the transition from safe to exposed. He told him that the wind would sound worse than it was at the granite, Finn. Don't speed up. That's when people make mistakes, and that the last 200 meters before the canyon floor had a shallow angle that looked safe but wasn't. So they needed to move one person at a time. Emre followed every instruction exactly. Finn found himself holding his breath each time one of them stepped into a new zone. He found himself exhaling when he heard we're through the static. You're on the floor of the canyon, Finn said. Stay on the east bank of the river. The train should be. I see it. Emre's voice changed. Still controlled, but something underneath it sharpened into a different register. I see it. Finn, there are people outside the cars. They're not moving. The way he said Finn's name, like it was something he'd known for longer than 20 minutes. Finn started moving toward the lower access. I'm 20 minutes behind you. Go. Emre had seen bad before. He'd done tours as a wilderness physician in Nepal, 2 seasons with the National Ski Patrol Medical Division, and 7 years of emergency medicine in places that didn't have the luxury of waiting for an ambulance. He knew how to look at chaos and find the thing that needed his hands first. What he saw in Gallatin Canyon on that November morning was bad in the specific, organized way of major trauma events, not pandemonium, but the systematic unraveling of physics. 2 passenger cars had left the track where a section of roadbed had eroded beneath the rail, the kind of failure that could have been prevented and hadn't been. The 3rd car was jackknifed against the canyon wall. The 1st car was fine. Of the 147 passengers, he counted 31 outside in the snow, 8 of them down. He started with the 8 who were down. His team fanned out the way they'd trained, his nurse Priya on airways, his EMT Jackson on hemorrhage control, his paramedic Sujin on vitals. Emre moving between all of them, triaging, directing, making the calls that didn't wait. He was stabilizing a woman with a suspected cervical fracture when he heard boots crunching through the snow behind him, heavy, purposeful, knowing where to step. Dr. Demir. He looked up. The man coming toward him was. Emre registered this in the way you register things. When your hands are occupied and your brain has 16 other priorities, filed and noted and not fully processed, tall, solidly built, wearing a high-visibility orange dot jacket that had ice crystals forming on the shoulders, red gold hair going dark with snow, green eyes that were already scanning the scene with the same assessment reflex that Emre recognized from his own mirror. His face had a cut above his left eyebrow, bleeding into his hairline. He hadn't noticed, or he had noticed and was ignoring it, which amounted to the same thing. Callahan, Emre said. Yeah. He looked at the woman Emre was stabilizing, then at the others, then at the train cars. What do you need? Emre handed him a cervical collar. Her head doesn't move. Go. Finn didn't blink. He moved into position like he'd been doing this his whole life, which maybe wasn't far from the truth. Emre watched him for exactly 2 seconds, hands certain, touch deliberate, the way someone handles something fragile without making it feel fragile, and then turned back to his own work. For 2 hours they were parallel systems, their orbits intersecting every 10 or 15 minutes the way the surgeons move around a table. Finn knew which doors on the train cars could be forced and which ones would trap a rescuer. He knew that the canyon wall was shedding ice sheets in cycles, and he positioned himself to track the pattern while Emre worked. Calling moved twice before anything came down, and both times Emre moved without looking up from his patient. That level of trust, the kind you build in controlled burns and field labs and years of working with people who know their limitations. Finn had never encountered it from someone he met 3 hours ago. At some point it started snowing harder. At some point the light went flat and gray and the canyon walls disappeared. At some point Finn was handing Emre equipment he hadn't asked for because he'd watched long enough to know what came next. Around the 90-minute mark, during a brief stillness while they waited for the medevac coordinates to confirm, Emre turned and looked at Finn properly for the first time since he'd arrived. The cut above his eye had stopped bleeding and started crusting. The blood had tracked down along his cheekbone and dried there, russet brown against wine-burned skin. He looked like a man who had been awake since before the world was reasonable, which was true. and he was standing with one shoulder against the canyon wall watching the snow come down. With the particular stillness of someone who has learned to rest without stopping, "You're bleeding," Emre said. "I know. I should close that after the last transfer." Emre looked at him for a moment. Finn was still watching the snow, not looking back. "It needs cleaning now or the cold will set it wrong." A pause. Something shifted in Finn's jaw, not quite a smile. "Is that a medical fact, or are you just used to getting what you want?" "Both," Emre said. "Sit down." There was a granite ledge out of the wind where Emre had staged some of his kit. Finn sat. Emre crouched in front of him and opened an irrigation kit, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. Emre cleaned the cut. It was a good one, a piece of debris from the second car, probably. When the door had come off its hinges harder than expected, it would leave a thin scar along the outer edge of his eyebrow. Emre worked around it with the focused quiet of someone who was thinking about more than the wound. Finn held still. Emre noticed this, the specific quality of his stillness, not tense, not checked out, just present, allowing. The way he held still when Emre had handed him the cervical collar. The way he held still when someone who knew what they were doing was doing it. "How long have you been doing avalanche control?" Emre asked, not because he needed to know, because the silence had a texture and he wanted to understand it. 8 years, a pause. 3 here, 5 in the Cascades before. You moved, yeah, another pause. The Cascades had better mountains. Montana had better, he trailed off. Outside, someone's radio crackled. Better reasons to stay. Emre looked up from the wound. Finn was looking at the canyon wall. Not at him, but something in the angle of it, something in the deliberateness of not looking, made Emre's hands slow for just a second before he went back to work. "You knew I'd take the center shoot," Emre said. "Before I agreed, I hoped." "Why?" Finn turned and looked at him then. The distance between them was less than Emre had registered. He'd been leaning into work on the cut, which meant their faces were close. Closer than the work required now that the work was nearly done. Finn's eyes were green in the flat canyon light, a color that didn't quite match anything in Emre's previous experience of green. "Because it was the safe one," Finn said. "And you seemed like someone who knew the difference between safe and easy." Emre held his gaze for a moment. Then he put a closure strip over the wound and pressed it down gently with his thumb, and did not acknowledge what his own pulse was doing. "Done," he said. Asterisk the last medevac lifted out at 4:17 in the afternoon. 147 passengers. 11 transported with serious injuries, none fatal. 20 treated and released on scene. 114 who would go home to their families with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Finn had counted all of them coming in, and he counted them leaving, because that was the habit he'd built in. 8 years, you didn't put the number down. Until the number was complete. The number was complete. He sat on the granite ledge and let his pack slip off his shoulders and looked at the canyon. The snow had leveled off into something steady and quiet, the way it sometimes did in the last hour before dark, like the mountain was breathing out. The rescue teams had packed up and gone. The canyon was empty except for the wreckage and the river and the sound of both. He heard footsteps and didn't turn around. "Your team made it out?" he asked. 20 minutes ago. Emre sat down next to him on the ledge. "Not far. Closer than strictly necessary, given the amount of ledge available. I told them I'd follow. I wanted to make sure the canyon was clear. It's clear. I know." A pause. "I wanted to see it empty." Finn understood that. The specific thing that happens when a place that was full of emergency becomes just a place again. When you need a moment to watch the transition before you leave. He'd never found language for it, but he'd never met anyone else who seemed to need the same moment. Either. "You worked backcountry in Nepal," he said. 2 seasons. "Medical support for trekking expeditions. Why'd you come back?" Emre was quiet for a moment. Outside the canyon, somewhere up on the ridge, the wind was making a sound like conversation. "Same reason as you. Probably. You don't know my reason. You said Montana had better reasons to stay." A pause. "You didn't finish the sentence." Finn turned and looked at him. Emre was looking at the canyon. Profile against the pale sky. dark eyes catching the last diffused light off the snow. He had blood on the cuff of his jacket, not his own. The careful practiced blood of a physician who has been doing this long enough that it doesn't read as anything except the evidence of work. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who is tired and doesn't particularly mind it. People, Finn said. Montana had better people. Something shifted in Emmer's expression. He turned then, and they were looking at each other. And the canyon was quiet, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually did. You know, Emre said, when you told me to take the center chute, I didn't know if I could trust you. And now, I trust you more than I've trusted most people I've known for years. Finn held his gaze. That's a fast read. I'm a fast reader. The corner of his mouth moved. It's a problem, sometimes. What's the problem? Emre looked at him. A careful look, the same look he'd been giving the Wound an hour ago. Precise, unhurried. Like he was deciding exactly how much to say and in what order. I'm leaving on Friday, he said. Gallatin Clinic contract ends. I go back to Denver, figure out whether to sign another season or try something else. That's not the problem, Finn said. No, Emre agreed. It's not. The canyon held the silence between them. Finn looked down at his hands, scarred across the knuckles, from 8 years of working outside in weather that did not care about him. Then he looked back at Emre. There's a diner in town, he said. Stays open late on weekdays. Coffee that'll make you feel like you got something right. Emre was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I have to file an incident report first. How long does that take? An hour. Maybe less if I skip the part where I explain why I stayed to watch the canyon empty. Skip it. Finn said. Emre smiled then, the first real one. The one that changed the shape of his face entirely. It was a good smile. The kind that arrived late and stayed. I'll meet you there, he said. They walked out of the canyon separately. Same trail, same footsteps in the snow. Not together, not yet. But Finn turned once, at the switchback where the trail bent away from the river, and looked back. Emre was still visible on the canyon floor, standing where they'd been sitting, looking up at the ridge. The way you look at a mountain when you're deciding whether to come back. Finn turned back to the trail and kept walking. He'd leave a light on.